The call came at a time when the world was supposed to be asleep. Ron had just finished a double shift, the kind that left his body heavy but his mind restless. He lay on the narrow bed of his rented room, staring at the ceiling fan slicing the warm air into slow, uneven pieces. Outside, the city hummed, foreign voices, traffic he had learned to tune out, a life he had been living for years but never truly belonged to. His phone vibrated once. Then again, he reached for it without urgency. No one called him at this number unless it was important, but importance had become a normal part of being far from home. He expected a message from work, maybe a schedule change, maybe nothing at all. He didn't expect the hospital. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. For a brief second, he considered letting it ring. He told himself he was tired. He told himself it could wait. He told himself that Rose had dialysis today, and dialysis was routine now, controlled, monitored. She had done this hundreds of times before. He answered anyway. Hello? The voice on the other end was calm in a way that felt rehearsed, professional, detached, the kind of calm that never brought good news. Is this Ron Donnelly? The man asked. Yes, Ron said, already sitting up. His heart began to beat louder, harder, as if it sensed what his mind was refusing to accept. This is Ron. This is Dr. Johnson from St. Mary's Medical Center. The room seemed to tilt. Ron pressed his free hand against the mattress. Yes, he said again, that's my wife's hospital. There was a pause, a breath, a sound of paper shifting. We regret to inform you, the doctor said, and Ron stopped hearing after that. The words that followed came in fragments: blood pressure, complications, dialysis session, rush to emergency, resuscitation attempts. They floated around him like debris after an explosion, meaningless on their own, too heavy together. Then the sentence that mattered arrived, quiet and final. We did everything we could. She was pronounced dead at 10:42 this afternoon. Ron felt something leave him, not a scream, not tears, just air, like his chest had collapsed inward. No, he said, shaking his head even though the doctor couldn't see him. No, you must be mistaken, she was fine. She texted me this morning before going to the hospital. She said she was tired but okay. I'm very sorry, Mr. Donnelly, the doctor replied gently. Her blood pressure spiked unexpectedly during dialysis. We stabilized her briefly, but her heart... No, Ron said again, louder this time. No, she's strong. She's been through worse than this. Silence. On the other side of the line, the doctor waited. He had said this before, too many times. I wish I had better news, he said. I am so sorry. The phone slipped from Ron's hand and landed on the bed with a dull thud. He stared at it as if it might ring again and undo what had just been said. Rose was gone. Rose, who reminded the kids to brush their teeth every night. Rose, who sent him photos of the sky when it rained at home. Rose, who complained about dialysis but never missed a session. Rose, who promised they would grow old together when this was all over. His wife was dead. Ron slid down onto the floor, his back against the bed, his knees pulled to his chest like a child who had nowhere to hide. He pressed his fist into his mouth, trying to keep the sound in. He didn't want neighbors in his apartment building knocking. He didn't want pity. He didn't want reality. Ron closed his eyes. 3 children. 3 lives that had just broken in ways they wouldn't fully understand yet. He picked up the phone with shaking hands and typed the hardest words he had ever had to write. I'm coming home. He booked the first flight available. He lived just a few states away from his family for work. He didn't remember how. He didn't remember packing. He only remembered sitting in the airport, staring at the departure board, feeling like the world was continuing out of spite. On the plane, surrounded by strangers, Ron finally cried, quietly, silently, the kind of crying that didn't make a sound but hurt everywhere. He cried for the years he spent working away from home while Rose went through treatments alone. He cried for the days he missed, the fights they postponed, the plans they never finished. Most of all, he cried because there was no goodbye, no last conversation, no holding her hand, no chance to say, I'm here now. When the plane landed, dawn was breaking. Ron looked out the window at his hometown coming into view, and for the first time since the call, he understood something terrifying. He wasn't just coming home for a funeral. He was coming home to a life where Rose no longer existed, and he didn't know how to live in it. Dialysis was never supposed to be the thing that took her. Rose had been doing it for years. It had become part of their language, woven into their marriage like an uninvited third presence they learned to tolerate. Tuesdays and Saturdays, early mornings, long afternoons, the machine's steady hum, the careful way she drank water, counting sips like sins, the bruises on her arm she joked about, calling them her battle marks. "This isn't how I go," she once told him over a video call, lifting her sleeve to show him a needle's sight. "I'll beat this first." He believed her. Everyone did. From the airport, Ron booked a taxi and directly went to the hospital. He stood outside the room where Rose's body had been prepared, the door closed, the nameplate already changed. A nurse passed by and gave him a sympathetic nod, the kind reserved for people whose lives had just split in two. He nodded back out of habit, because politeness had not yet left him, even if everything else had. The doctor who spoke to him again was the same one from the call. Dr. Johnson looked older up close, lines etched deep around his eyes, as if he carried the weight of all the families he had broken. "I want to walk you through what happened," the doctor said gently, motioning Ron to sit. Ron nodded. He needed to hear it. Needed the logic, the science, the explanation that might make the impossible feel inevitable instead of random. She came in for her scheduled session, Dr. Johnson began. Everything was stable. Vitals were within acceptable ranges. About 40 minutes in, her blood pressure began to rise unexpectedly. Ron stared at the floor. "We adjusted. We monitored closely." She complained of dizziness, then chest discomfort. "We stopped the session immediately and transferred her to the ER. She was scared," Ron said quietly. "It wasn't a question." The doctor hesitated. "She asked for you." The words landed like a physical blow. Ron's hands curled into fists. He imagined her on the gurney, surrounded by strangers, machines beeping, her breath shallow. He imagined her reaching for a phone that wasn't there. Imagined her thinking he was too far away to matter. "We administered medication to lower her blood pressure," Dr. Johnson continued. "But her heart went into distress. We attempted resuscitation for several minutes." Several minutes. Ron thought of all the minutes he had wasted over the years. The calls he postponed because he was tired. The conversations cut short because of work. The promises of soon and next year and when this is over. She didn't feel pain, the doctor said, as if reading his thoughts. She lost consciousness quickly. The doctor continued, "According to her files, should anything happen to her, that we need to contact you first and not the kids. They might be worried right now as she hasn't returned home." Ron nodded, though his chest burned with disbelief. Pain had followed Rose for years. It seemed unfair that death would suddenly be merciful. After the doctor left, Ron was allowed to see her. She lay still on the bed, her hands folded neatly over her stomach, her face peaceful in a way that felt wrong. This version of Rose looked like she was resting after a long day, waiting for him to wake her up for dinner. He stepped closer, afraid that if he touched her she would disappear. "Hey," he whispered, his voice breaking immediately. "I'm home." No response. He reached for her hand. It was cold. Ron flinched, pulling back as if burned. He stared at his own hand, the same one that had held hers through so many hospital visits, now unable to recognize it. "I thought we had more time," he said, the words tumbling out now, unstoppable. "You said we did, you promised." He waited, listened, begged the room silently for a miracle. Nothing happened. He pressed his forehead to the edge of the bed and sobbed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a desperation that came from the deepest place inside him. This wasn't grief yet. This was shock cracking open. The moment he arrived home from the hospital, Ron sat with the kids in the small living room, the same place Rose used to sit folding laundry while reminding them to finish homework. The lights were too bright. Everything felt exposed. "I need you to listen to me," Ron said, his voice hoarse. The kids could sense that something terrible happened to their mom because she did not come home. But they were a bit hopeful that she would recover from whatever happened to their mom. They knew she was a tough cookie. The youngest clutched a pillow. The middle child stared at the floor. The eldest stood rigid, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. "Mom didn't make it," Ron said. The words hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. "What do you mean?" one of them asked. "She's always sick. She always comes back." Ron swallowed. "Not this time." The youngest cried immediately, loud, unfiltered, heart-shattering sobs that cut through Ron like glass. The middle child didn't cry at all, just stared harder at the floor as if it might open and swallow them whole. The eldest exploded. "This is on you. You should have been here this whole time. Bring us to Mom right now." Ron took the words without defense, without explanation, without protest, because part of him believed it too. Ron's eyes were now filled with tears. "I am so sorry." but they did what they could to stabilize Mom's condition, and he cried along with the kids. The kids hugged each other while pain filled the house with their uncontrollable sobbing. Ron apologized profusely for not being there. I needed to work far so I could afford the hospital bills. I am sorry. She meant the world to me, and I was willing to sacrifice my time away from you if that meant longer time with Mom, Ron said in between tears. That night, after everyone finally fell asleep from exhaustion rather than peace, Ron sat alone at the kitchen table. Rose's mug was still there, half-washed. Her cardigan hung over the back of a chair. He picked up her mug and held it to his chest. Dialysis was supposed to be ordinary. It wasn't supposed to be the end. And yet, everything had ended there. The house had learned how to be quiet a few days after Rose passed away. Ron noticed it the first morning he woke up alone, not alone as in empty, but alone in the way that mattered. The children were still asleep, scattered in their rooms like they always had been, but something was missing from the air itself. Rose's voice. She used to hum in the mornings, soft, absent-minded melodies that drifted through the hallway as she prepared breakfast or packed lunches. Even on days when she was tired from dialysis, she hummed. It was her way of insisting that life was still happening. Now the silence pressed in from every direction. Ron sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the indentation beside him where she used to sleep. The pillow still smelled faintly like her shampoo. He pressed his face into it, inhaling deeply, desperately, like someone trying to steal back time. The alarm went off at 6. Rose had set it years ago and never changed it. Ron reached over and turned it off, his fingers shaking. He considered smashing the clock against the wall, but instead he placed it carefully back on the bedside table. Destroying things wouldn't bring her back. Down the hall, a door creaked open. The youngest padded into the living room, hair sticking up in every direction, eyes red and swollen. They stopped when they saw Ron. "Dad, I need to pee. I need help," he asked quietly. Ron nodded. "Okay." The word will feel foreign in his mouth. Rose had always done the mornings. He had handled money, work, logistics. She handled life. He moved mechanically through the kitchen, pulling out bread, eggs, whatever he could find. The fridge was full of things Rose had bought, food she liked, snacks for dialysis days, leftovers carefully labeled with dates. "Dad," the middle child asked from the doorway, "I don't think we have soap anymore. Can you buy some toiletries?" Ron turned, his hands gripping the counter so tightly his knuckles went white. "Okay. Later I will," he said. The eldest entered last, already dressed, already armored. She didn't look at Ron. "I'm not hungry," she said flatly. Ron nodded. He didn't force it. He didn't know how to force anything anymore. The days that followed blurred together. Condolences arrived in waves, relatives, neighbors, old friends. People brought food they couldn't eat and said words that sounded rehearsed. "She's in a better place. She's no longer suffering. You have to be strong for the kids." Ron nodded, thanked them, listened without listening. Strength felt like a cruel expectation. He didn't want to be strong. He wanted to be allowed to fall apart. At night, when the children were asleep, Ron wandered the house like a ghost. He found Rose everywhere. Her scarf draped over a chair, her handwriting on grocery lists, her phone charger still plugged in beside the couch. In the bathroom, her toothbrush stood next to his, untouched. He picked it up, stared at it for a long time, then placed it back exactly where it was. Moving it felt like betrayal. One evening, while folding laundry, Ron found a shirt of hers, soft, worn thin from years of use. He pressed it to his face and broke down, sinking to the floor as the weight of everything finally crushed him. "I don't know how to do this without you," he whispered into the fabric. "You were supposed to teach me." In the days after the funeral, paperwork began to pile up. Death, Ron learned, came with an overwhelming amount of administration. Forms, signatures, decisions he wasn't ready to make. The children struggled in different ways. The youngest asked questions that had no answers. The middle child grew quiet, disappearing into books and screens. The eldest stayed angry at the world, at Ron, at Rose for leaving. One night, Ron overheard the eldest crying behind a locked door. "I didn't even say goodbye," she sobbed. "I was mad at her." Ron leaned his forehead against the door, his heart splitting open again. "Neither did I," he said softly, but she knew, she always knew. He hoped it was true. That weekend, Ron went to the cemetery for the first time alone. Rose's grave was still fresh, the earth dark and unsettled. A simple marker bore her name, the dates too close together for comfort. He stood there, hands shoved into his pockets, unsure of what to do. "I brought you flowers," he said finally. Holding up a small bouquet, white rose, her favorite, he knelt and placed them gently at the base of the marker. "I'll come back," he promised. "I don't know when, but I will." As he walked away, he felt something new beneath the grief. Fear that one day the house would learn to be quiet without hurting so much. Fear that the silence would become normal. And worst of all, fear that life would go on without her. Ron had spent years learning how to leave. Leaving before dawn for work away from home. Leaving birthdays with video calls. Leaving Rose to manage doctor visits and school meetings while he promised it was all temporary. Leaving had been a skill, necessary, practiced, justified by survival. Staying, however, was foreign. The first weeks back home felt like he was wearing someone else's life. He woke up every morning disoriented, reaching for his phone to check the time before remembering there was nowhere else he needed to be. No flight to catch, no contract to renew, just a house that expected him to show up fully. He found work quickly, not because he was ready, but because he had to be. And although it was not as high-paying compared to his work prior, it was more than enough to sustain a family of 4. The children needed stability, food, school supplies, normalcy, or whatever version of it they could manage. He needed to be visible as he should. The job was local, modest, predictable. Ron accepted it without complaint. Every morning he prepared breakfast now, burnt toast at first, overcooked eggs. Gradually things improved. The youngest began to help, standing on a chair at the counter, stirring batter too enthusiastically. "You're doing it wrong," the eldest muttered one morning. "I know," Ron replied simply, "but we'll learn." They ate in relative silence, the absence of Rose heavy but no longer shocking. The pain had settled into something duller, deeper, a constant ache rather than a sharp wound. After work, Ron often stopped by the cemetery. It became part of his routine, as natural as breathing. He brought flowers every time, sometimes store-bought bouquets, sometimes simple stems wrapped in brown paper. He talked to Rose as if she were sitting beside him on the grass. "Works fine," he'd say. "The kids are adjusting." He told her about the youngest losing their first tooth, about the middle child's sudden obsession with astronomy, about the eldest, who pretended not to care but lingered in the doorway when Ron checked on them at night. "I'm trying," he said once, his voice cracking. "I really am." The cemetery was quiet at that hour, just a few people scattered among the stones. Ron never stayed long. He didn't want the children to worry. He didn't want to become someone who lived more with the dead than the living. Still, he came back again and again. One afternoon, weeks later, Ron approached Rose's grave with his usual bouquet in hand and stopped. There were flowers already there, fresh ones, not wilted, not old, carefully arranged. Ron stood frozen, his heart thudding violently in his chest. He looked around, half expecting to see someone nearby. The cemetery was empty, confused. He knelt and examined the flowers. They weren't the kind he bought. Different flowers, different wrapping. Someone else had been here. A strange unease crept over him. At first, he told himself it must have been family, maybe Rose's cousin, a friend he had forgotten to ask. He placed his own flowers beside them, feeling oddly intrusive, and went home. That night, he texted Rose's sister. "Did you visit Rose today?" The reply came quickly, "No, I haven't been able to go yet." Why? He stared at the screen. The next day, he asked her parents. They shook their heads. "Too painful," they said. "Not yet." Friends and neighbors he casually saw in the village, no one claimed the flowers. Ron returned to the cemetery 3 days later. Again, there were new flowers. This time, his chest tightened painfully. Why would someone come here and not tell him? A darker thought crept in, uninvited. Someone who loved her enough to come back. Ron shook his head, angry at himself. No, Rose loved him. They had a life, 3 children, shared history, shared suffering, shared dreams. Still, doubt had a way of rooting itself deep once planted. Over the next weeks, Ron paid closer attention. Every visit, new flowers appeared, sometimes simple, sometimes elaborate, always fresh. The questions began to consume him. Who was this person? Why now, after she was gone? One night, lying awake beside the empty space in his bed, Ron whispered into the darkness, "Please tell me the truth." But Rose remained silent, and the flowers kept coming. The questions didn't arrive all at once. They crept in slowly, quietly, the way doubt always does, soft enough at first to be ignored, sharp enough later to wound. Ron tried to be reasonable. Rose had lived a full life before him. She had friends from school, from work. from places and seasons he hadn't been part of. It was possible, likely even, that someone cared enough to remember her quietly. Still, the thought gnawed at him. Every bouquet felt like a message meant for someone else. He began visiting the cemetery at different times, hoping to catch whoever it was. Early mornings before work, late afternoons when the sun dipped low, even once on a Sunday when families filled the grounds with murmured prayers. Each time he came alone. The flowers were always there. At home, Ron found himself replaying moments from his marriage with new, unwanted suspicion. Small things he had never questioned before now returned with uncomfortable clarity. Times Rose seemed distracted on calls. Moments she changed the subject too quickly. Long pauses when he asked how she was really doing. Was she lonely? Was I too far away? The guilt piled on top of grief until Ron felt buried beneath both. One evening, while washing dishes, Ron overheard the eldest speaking to the middle child. "Dad goes to the cemetery a lot," the eldest said quietly. "So?" the middle child replied. "So maybe he's afraid," the eldest said. "Like maybe Mom had secrets." Ron's hands stilled in the soapy water. Secrets. That night Ron couldn't sleep. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, imagining scenarios he hated himself for creating. A stranger, a quiet affair, someone who knew parts of Rose he hadn't. He hated the thought, not just because of jealousy, but because it threatened the story he told himself to survive. That Rose loved him, that their life mattered, that her death was tragic, not complicated. The next day Ron did something he never thought he would. He went through Rose's things, not the obvious ones, not the clothes or jewelry. He went looking for evidence. He checked old messages on her phone, heart pounding with every swipe. Emails, notes, contacts he didn't recognize. Nothing. Her conversations were ordinary, loving, sometimes frustrated, sometimes tired, but always honest. "Miss you, tell the kids I love them. Don't forget to rest too." Ron sank onto the couch, relief and shame mixing painfully in his chest. "I'm sorry," he whispered to her absence. "I shouldn't have doubted you." But the flowers still remained. One afternoon, Ron finally asked someone who might know. The cemetery groundskeeper, an older man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, sweeping fallen leaves near Rose's section. "Excuse me," Ron said. "Have you noticed someone visiting this grave regularly?" The man paused, resting on his broom. "This one?" he asked, glancing at Rose's marker. "Yes," he nodded slowly. "A woman comes by sometimes, early mornings mostly." Ron's pulse quickened. "Do you know her?" The man shook his head. "No names, she's respectful, always leaves flowers. Never stays long." "A woman," Ron repeated. The words settled heavily between them. He thanked the groundskeeper and walked away, his thoughts racing. A woman, not an affair in the way he imagined, but still someone who mattered to Rose. Who was she? Why had Rose never spoken of her? And why did Ron feel like he was standing on the edge of a truth he wasn't ready to hear? Ron began asking questions carefully. He didn't want to sound accusatory. He didn't want to disturb memories that were still fragile, still sacred. But the not knowing was starting to weigh heavier than the possibility of the truth. He started with Rose's family. At a small gathering after Sunday lunch, he waited until the conversation drifted into comfortable silence before asking, "Did Rose have any close friends from before we met? Someone who might still visit her?" Her sister frowned thoughtfully. "She had friends, of course, classmates, old co-workers, but no one specific that I can think of." "Why?" Ron shrugged. "Someone's been leaving flowers." Her mother clasped her hands together. "That's kind," she said softly. "She always had a way of touching people." Ron nodded, forcing a smile. He didn't push further. Next, he reached out to old neighbors, people who had known Rose when she was younger, before illness shaped her days. They spoke of her kindness, her laughter, her reliability, but no one mentioned a woman who jogged by the cemetery each morning. At work, Ron found his concentration slipping. Numbers blurred. Conversations passed without registering. His mind always returned to the same image, fresh flowers against cold stone. One evening, while sorting through an old box of photographs with the youngest, Ron found himself staring at a picture he hadn't seen in years. Rose, younger, carefree, surrounded by classmates in worn uniforms, a wide smile on her face. "Who's that?" the youngest asked, pointing to a girl standing close beside Rose, their arms slung over each other's shoulders. Ron squinted. The girl had sharp eyes and easy smile, familiar somehow. "I'm not sure," Ron admitted. The youngest tilted their head. "She looks like they were really close." Ron swallowed. Later that night, after the children were asleep, Ron sat alone with the photo. He turned it over. On the back, in Rose's handwriting, was a single name, with Lisa. The name echoed faintly in his memory. He remembered her at the funeral now, a woman standing at the back, eyes red, hands clasped tightly together. He had been too consumed by grief to place her then. The next morning, Ron went to the cemetery earlier than usual. The sky was still pale, the air cool, dew clung to the grass. He waited. Minutes passed. Then 20. Just as he began to think the groundskeeper had been mistaken, he saw her. A woman jogged in through the gate, slowing as she approached Rose's grave. She stopped, pulled a small bouquet from her bag, and knelt. Ron stayed where he was, heart pounding. She arranged the flowers carefully, her movements deliberate, reverent. She bowed her head for a moment, lips moving in a silent conversation meant for someone who could no longer answer. When she stood, Ron stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said gently. She turned, startled. For a moment they simply looked at each other. "I'm Ron," he said, "Rose's husband." Her face drained of color. "Oh, yes, I do know you, Ron," she whispered. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," Ron said quickly. I needed to know." She nodded, eyes filling with tears. "I'm Lisa." The name settled everything. They stood there in silence, grief finally taking a recognizable shape. "I was her best friend," Lisa said softly, "from high school." Ron exhaled slowly. "Thank you for the flowers." She shook her head. She deserved more. Ron looked down at Rose's grave, at the fresh blooms resting against stone. They sat on a nearby bench, the cemetery stretching quietly around them. Morning light filtered through the trees, soft and forgiving, as if the world itself was trying not to intrude. "I come here every morning before I jog," Lisa said. Her hands folded tightly in her lap. "It started after the funeral. I told myself it would be just once." Ron listened without interrupting. "But once didn't feel like enough," she continued. "Rose and I, we were inseparable in high school, different friend groups, sure, but when we were together, it was like no time had passed. We always said we'd catch up properly someday." Her voice wavered. "Someday never came." Ron nodded slowly. He understood that kind of regret too well. "She talked about you," Ron said. "Sometimes, not often, but always kindly." Lisa smiled through tears. "She talked about you all the time, said you were her anchor, that even when you were far away, she felt safe knowing you were there." The words settled gently into Ron's chest, easing a pain he hadn't realized was still sharp. "I felt so guilty," Lisa admitted. "We kept postponing meeting. Work, life, excuses. When I heard she was sick, I told myself I'd visit. Then the pandemic happened, then it was too late." She wiped at her eyes. "The flowers are my way of keeping my promise, of showing up even now." Ron stared out at the rows of headstones, each one a story, a regret, a love unfinished. "I thought," he hesitated. "For a while, I thought maybe she had a life I didn't know about, someone else." Lisa looked at him in shock. "No, never. She adored you. She worried about you constantly, about how hard you worked, how lonely it must get." Ron closed his eyes, the last of his doubts dissolving. "I'm glad she had you," Lisa said softly, "but I'm also glad she had me as her ride and die, at least in a chapter of her life." Ron smiled faintly. She was good at collecting people. They sat in silence again, comfortable now, the tension gone. "I won't stop coming," Lisa said eventually. "If that's okay." Ron nodded. "I think she'd like that." As Lisa stood to leave, she hesitated. "Thank you, but how I wished she was still here. I never had the chance to even introduce my daughter to her. How I wished to catch up with her." Ron looked back at Rose's grave, the flowers bright against stone. "Thank you," he said, "for remembering her." Lisa jogged away, disappearing down the path. Ron remained. He knelt and placed his own bouquet beside the others, no longer feeling crowded, no longer feeling replaced. He spoke softly. "You were never alone," he told Rose, "and neither was I." For the first time since her death, Ron felt something close to peace, not because the pain was gone, but because love, hers, his, theirs, had revealed itself to be bigger than loss. The days began to stretch differently now. Ron rose with the sun, not out of habit, but out of necessity. The children's laughter and complaints filled the house in a way that no grief could silence. And slowly, he realized that life was asking him to participate again. He visited Rose's grave less for answers now, and more for the comfort of continuity. He placed flowers when he could, sometimes with Lisa nearby, sometimes alone. The arrangement no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a ritual, a way to honor a love that had shaped his life, and a woman who had left an imprint on everyone she touched. Work kept him busy. he learned to focus, to find small joys in routine. Breakfasts with the children were no longer moments of despair, but spaces where he could teach them, laugh with them, and feel them grow in ways that Rose would have loved. The eldest sometimes teased him about his cooking. The youngest demanded pancakes even on Wednesdays. The middle child started reading aloud every evening, a habit Rose had loved. One weekend afternoon, Ron visited the cemetery to find Lisa sitting on the porch near Rose's tomb. She waved at him a quiet greeting. "Hey there, how are you?" Lisa said, standing when he approached. Her smile was soft, comforting, and filled with understanding. Ron nodded. "Soldiering on, I guess." They walked to the cemetery together. This time, the flowers were fewer, more modest. Lisa explained that she had begun to bring a single bloom, a quiet offering, because she realized the space she shared with Ron at Rose's grave was enough. For the first time, Ron understood fully what the flowers meant. Not jealousy, not secrets, not betrayal, but love expressed by a dear friend in its simplest, purest form. Love that survived absence, distance, and even death. At home, the children noticed his lighter step. They laughed more freely, encouraged more boldly, and sometimes Ron even smiled without the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. He spoke of Rose openly, telling stories she would have loved to hear, keeping her alive in memory, in voice, in laughter. And at night, when the house was quiet, Ron sometimes sat alone and imagined her there, smiling at him, nodding in approval at the life he was slowly piecing together. He realized that living with grief wasn't about forgetting or moving on. It was about carrying love forward, nurturing it in new ways, and allowing it to grow beyond the boundaries of absence. Somewhere in the quiet moments, Ron finally understood. Rose's death had not left him empty. It had left him entrusted with her memory, her children, and the courage to keep living, truly living for both of them. And for the first time, Ron felt ready, not to leave, not to escape, but to stay, to honor what remained, and to embrace the unexpected kindnesses that life still offered. The end.